Architecturalization. Do architects look at the world in a certain way? I once had that discussion with Bernard Schumi, who designed the FIU School of Architecture and at that time was the dean at Columbia. And we both agreed that architects have a particular way of looking at the world that allows them to see it in a certain way. But could we take this idea and explore it further? Does the way in which architects look at the world allow them to take the forms of the outside world and translate them into architectural forms? An obvious example, perhaps, would be the design of the Sydney Opera House by Jorn Utzon. This on the left-hand side is a sketch that Utzon submitted as his entry for the competition for the Sydney Opera House, and it was inspired by the billowing sails of the yachts in Sydney Harbour. There's a clear relationship, in other words. Utzon saw these sails and, in some senses, translated them into architectural form. He architecturalized them. As it happened, the final version of the Sydney Opera House proved to be quite different because the engineers weren't able to work with this sketch and it changed into something else. But this was the initial sketch, and you can see the original inspiration for this sketch. Can architects take the forms they find around them in the environment around them and read them as architectural forms? Well, there are many examples that we can find around us of where architects have been inspired by nature and by other aspects of the environment. They see the forms, and in some ways, through a process of either biomimicry or biomimetics, they are inspired by the forms themselves or the way in which they operate. And we know very much about this particular approach. There are other examples, of course, about the way in which designers, not just architects, but all sorts of designers, car designers, shoe designers, and so on, are inspired by the systems in nature and the way they behave. This allows them to design in a certain sort of way. And we could see this. There are many examples of this. Inspiration from nature and the way that, for example, trains are designed. There are any number of ways in which we can look at the natural systems as inspiration for how we end up designing individual products, like this plane inspired by this bird. Well, that much is obvious. We as architects are inspired by the world around us, and we draw inspiration that we then maybe translate into our designs. But the interesting question, if we think about the process of architecturalization, is how you can take a concept or an idea and then start translating that into an architectural form. This was an issue perhaps with the whole approach towards the discrete. On the left-hand side, the issue of architectural design edited by Gilles Redsin, where he produces a whole publication based on the concept of the discrete. The notion of the discrete comes from the world of computation. The digital is discrete, and we know that. But that discourse is not necessarily applying to architectural forms, it's talking about computation itself. But then what Redsin does is take that concept of the discrete and translates that into, let's say, a style of architecture in which the form becomes an architectural form. The idea becomes an architectural form. We can find a similar example in the work of Mario Carpo in The Second Digital Turn, where he contemplates what it is to produce an architectural style of big data. What would be a style of big data, if there is such a thing? Well, according to Carpo, he reads somewhere that big data is messy, and therefore the design on the right-hand side of a 3D printed chair, also as it happens by Gilles Redsin, becomes the inspiration for what he calls the style of big data. If big data is messy, then there is an architectural style which is also messy. This is a little confusing in some senses because if you think about big data, is there a form of big data? Let's take the example of Uber. Can we say there is a style of Uber cars? Are Uber cars any different to any other car? Are they different to ordinary cars? Well, no, because Uber cars are ordinary cars. What makes Ubercars different is not the form, not their form itself. It's not as though they have a different style, it's the way that they operate. They harness the logic of big data and allow you to, for a different system, to hail a taxi. That's how they operate. It would be a mistake to think the big data is anything to do with form. It's about information itself. But where this concept perhaps gets most interesting is when we see how certain philosophical terms get translated into architectural forms by architects. Gilles Deleuze published this book, The Fold, Leibniz and the Baroque. Gilles Deleuze is a French philosopher, and that inspired another edition of architectural design, Folding in Architecture. It was as though the concept of the fold that Deleuze was talking about inspired a whole logic, a whole language of architectural form based on folding. But Deleuze was not talking about architectural form. He wasn't even talking about form itself. He was talking about philosophical concepts, about ways of thinking, the folding, as it were, of thought. A similar mistake in some senses was made by the surfing community. There was a whole following of Deleuze because of his concept of the fold, and they were obsessed by some of his notions. Likewise, Deleuze referred to surfing in some of his books because of the following that he had within the surfing community. But was Deleuze referring to surfing when he spoke about the concept of the fold? No, he was talking about a philosophical concept. So the surfing community, like the architectural community, in some ways, had made a form out of an architectural concept. And we can take the concept of architecturalization further. Perhaps the most explicit example of this would be the concept of deconstruction, coined by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. Jacques Derrida was interested in the way that our thought processes have themselves been constructed. An example would be in the way in which we see seven colors in the rainbow. That is a constructed understanding of the rainbow. So he uses the term deconstruction in a sense as an architectural metaphor. What we have to do, Derrida argues, is dismantle all those presuppositions in our language and get down to a solid foundation on which to build an argument. In other words, deconstruction is about dismantling suppositions. It's about getting to a point where you can build an argument. It is in many ways an architectural metaphor. But architects saw the term deconstruction and somehow automatically assumed that he was talking about architecture, and hence a whole series of publications about deconstruction in architecture. I've been to a couple of lectures given by Jacques Derrida, and in both those lectures, someone from the audience asked him this question: what relationship does your philosophy have to the architectural forms that are inspired by that philosophy? Both times he answered in the same way. He paused, and then he commented in a typically French way, using a kind of double entendre or wordplay. He said, maybe it's better not to respond than to respond irresponsibly. But then he went on to say, well, I've got no idea what my philosophy has got to do with the architectural forms of deconstruction. This, in many ways, was the most obvious example of architecturalization. Architecturalization, not just of forms of nature, but architecturalization of ideas and concepts within philosophy.